First Circle by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Chapter 80 of 510. In the morning, Reuben was still painfully obsessed by his discussion with Solzhenitsyn. He kept thinking of more and more arguments he could have used. Fortunately, as the day wore on, he became absorbed in his important task and the memory faded. He worked on the second floor, in the quiet, small, top-secret room with a threadbare carpet, an old sofa, and heavy curtains at the sides of the window and the door. The soft surfaces deadened sound, but there was hardly any sound anyway, as Reuben listened to the tapes through earphones, while Smolazadov said nothing all day and scowled at him as though he were an enemy and not a colleague. Reuben took no notice of him except as a robot who was there to change the spools. Putting on his earphones, he listened endlessly to the fateful conversations of the suspects. Sometimes he accepted the evidence of his ears, sometimes he despaired of it, and turned to the violent squiggles of the voice prints recorded for each of the conversations. The many yards of paper tape overflowed the large desk and spiraled to the floor on either side. Anxious, he consulted his album of specimen voice prints, classified by phonetic pattern and basic tone for a variety of male voices. Snatching up his red and blue pencil, worn to a smooth ball at either end, sharpening a pencil was always an undertaking for him, he marked the key passages on the tapes. The work held him spellbound. His red-brown eyes seemed to burn. His long, unkempt black beard was rough and straggling. Grey ash rained steadily from the pipe or cigarette. One or the other was always in his mouth. Onto his beard, the sleeves of his greasy denims with the missing button on one cuff, the desk, the album, the tapes. He was in that state of mysterious mental exaltation for which physiologists have so far failed to account. Forgetting his upset liver and the pains due to his high blood pressure, straight from his exhausting night, he did not even feel hungry, although his last meal had been the pastry he had eaten at the birthday party the night before. His spirits soared, his eyes were preternaturally alert, his memory was ready to yield all it had stored up over the years. He never once asked the time. When he first came in, he tried to open a window to let some air into the stuffy room, but Smolazadov had growled, "Don't do that, I have a cold," and Reuben obeyed. Since then, he had not got up from his chair, not once looked out the window at the snow turning grey in the moist west wind. He had not so much as heard Shikin knock at the door, or Smolazadov telling him to stay out. As through a fog, he'd seen Reutman come and go, and had muttered something over his shoulder without turning around. The bell had rung for dinner, and again at the end of the midday break without his being aware of it. The instinct of the prisoner, for whom food is a sacred ritual, stirred in him only when Reutman shook him by the shoulder, pointing at a side table where an omelette, cheesecakes with sour cream and stewed fruit were laid out. His eyes widened in surprise, but he was still in a trance. Staring puzzled at this food fit for the gods, as though wondering why it was there, he changed tables and bolted it down, tasting nothing, only wanting to go back to his work. Yet this meal, so little appreciated by Reuben, had cost Reutman more than if he'd paid for it out of his own pocket. For 2 whole hours he'd been on the phone, coordinating the arrangements with the special equipment section of the ministry, with General Bulbenyuk, with the prison administration and supplies, and finally, with Colonel Klementiev. Those he spoke to, in their turn, rang up accounts in various other departments. The difficulty was that Reuben was on third-class rations, but in view of the urgency of the task and its importance to the state, Reutman wanted him upgraded to first class, and to an invalid diet as well. After everything had been settled, the prison authorities raised further difficulties. There was no such food in the prison store, the cook had to be paid extra for preparing special meals, and there was no allowance for this in the budget. Now, having achieved his end, Reutman sat, looking across the table at Reuben, not as a slave driver who wants to get the most out of the slave, but smiling fondly, as at a grown-up child, admiring him, envying his enthusiasm, waiting for the right moment to ask him about his day's work, and longing to share in it himself. Reuben ate everything to the last crumb and sat back, his relaxed face showing signs of returned consciousness. For the first time that morning he smiled. "You shouldn't have fed me. Sater venter non studa et lebenter." The traveller should cover the greater part of his way before stopping for food. "Have you looked at the clock? It's 3:15. "What? I thought it wasn't 12 yet. You know, I'm bursting with curiosity. What are your findings so far?" So far from this being an order from a superior, Reutman spoke diffidently, as though afraid that Reuben would refuse to tell him. At moments when he was human, Reutman had great charm in spite of his ungainly appearance and his full mouth that was always hanging open because of his adenoids. "I'm just beginning, there's still only preliminary conclusions." "But what are they?" "Well, some are open to argument, but there's one that's not. The technique of voice printing, born on December 26th, 1949, does have a valid scientific basis." "You're not being carried away?" Reutman asked cautiously. He was as anxious to be convinced as Reuben. But his training in the exact sciences warned him that Reuben, the humanist, was capable of letting his enthusiasm get the better of his meticulousness as a scholar. "When have you seen me get carried away?" said Reuben. He stroked his tousled beard. "The 2 years we spent collecting material, all those tonal and syllabic analyses of the Russian speech, the study of sound shapes, the classification of voices, the research into national, group and individual speech mannerisms. All that work Yakonov thought was a waste of time. And let's face it, even you had an occasional twinge of doubt. That's paying off now. We should co-opt Nergine, don't you think?" "Well, if all goes well, why not? But at the moment we have to prove ourselves by succeeding in our first assignment." "Our first assignment? We don't know half enough for that yet. It can't be done that quickly. But, don't you realise how urgent this is wanted?" Did he realise? Wanted and urgently were the words he'd grown up with in the Komsomol. They were the ubiquitous slogans of the 30s. There was no steel, no electricity, no bread, no clothes, but all were urgently wanted. And so the blast furnaces had gone up and the mills started to roll. Later, in the years before the war, the sedate pace of academic research, the leisureliness of the 18th century, which was his period, had spoiled him. But the call, urgently wanted, could always rouse him. It was always at the back of his mind and spurred him on to see a job through to the end. The daylight coming through the window was growing dim. They switched on the ceiling light, sat at the desk and examined the patterns, characteristic sounds, groups of consonants and intonation lines marked off in blue and red pencil on the tapes. They worked together, paying no attention to Smolozadov, who sat all day without once leaving the room, guarding the magnetic tape like a surly black watchdog. He now sat looking at the backs of their heads, his heavy, unblinking stare drilling through their skulls and pressing like a tumour on their brains. Smolozadov deprived them of the smallest yet the most important element in their work, spontaneity. He was the witness of their present hesitations, as he would be the witness of their confident report to the authorities. They swung from confidence to doubt and back. When one was up, the other was down. Reutemann was held back by his mathematical precision, but driven on by fear of losing his job. Reuben was restrained by his unselfish desire to found a genuine new science, but spurred on by his training as a Komsomol in the 30s. Thus both decided not to add to the list of 5 suspects. They dismissed from their minds the niggling suggestion that tapes would be made of the voices of the 4 who had been detained at the Arbat metro station. In any case, they'd been detained too late, or of the few others Bulbalnyuk had promised to record if necessary. They also dismissed the possibility that the call might not have been made by the man who was in the secret, but at his request. It was difficult enough to cope with the 5 they had already. They compared the voices with that of the criminal. They also compared the voice prints. "Look how much the analysis of the voice prints gives us," said Reuben. "At first the criminal tried to change his voice to disguise it, you can hear that. But look at the voice prints, only the intensity of the frequencies is affected. There's no change in the individual speech type at all. That's our main discovery, the speech type. Even if he disguised his voice to the end, he could not have concealed its individual character." "But we don't yet know enough about the extent to which a voice can be changed," said Reutemann. "Perhaps in the micro-intonations. There the range is very wide." Although it was possible to doubt the evidence of the ear as to where the voice was different and how they were alike, the changing pattern of sound waves on the diagrams seemed to bring the differences out more clearly. The only trouble was the roughness of the visible record. The instrument picked out a few of the frequency channels and showed the amplitude of the frequency only by indistinguishable smudges. It had not, after all, been designed for such precision work. 2 of the 5 suspects, Zavarzin and Zyagovity, could be eliminated at once, assuming that the method allowed any deduction to be made from a single conversation. With less certainty, Petrov could be eliminated as well. Reuben had no hesitation in doing so. On the other hand, the voices of both Volodin and Chervonok had much in common with that of the criminal. They were alike in both the individual type and the frequency of their bass tone, while the sounds O, R, L, and Sh were identical in all 3. The job in hand was ideal for testing the efficiency of the apparatus. Filled with triumph as its creators, Reutemann and Reuben leaned back and surveyed the future. Already they could see the day when an elaborate organisation, similar to that for fingerprinting, would exist. A central register with the recorded voices of all who'd ever been suspected. Every criminal's talk would be filed and the villain caught as surely as the burglar whose prints are on the safe. But the door opened and Osklopov's aide announced the imminent arrival of his master. 2 men sobered up. Science was all very well, but now they must agree their report and be ready to defend it in front of the head of the department. Reutemann thought they achieved a great deal. Knowing that authorities dislike hypotheses and want everything clear-cut, he agreed to eliminate Petrov and tell the Major General that the only suspects left were Chervonok and Volodin. Both were to be further investigated within the next couple of days. "Of course," said Reutemann, "we mustn't dismiss psychology altogether. We ought all the same to try and imagine what kind of a man could bring himself to do such a thing. What could make him do it? And then compare our picture of him with what we know of the suspects. We should raise the question, in future we shouldn't only be given a record of the suspect's voice and his name. We should know something about his position, what he does, his background, maybe even an outline of his past. I feel even now I could make a psychological sketch of this criminal. But Reuben, who only yesterday had maintained to the artist that objective knowledge is not coloured by emotion, had by now picked his man. Of course, I've considered the psychological factors. On the whole, they point to Volodin. In talking to his wife, he uses that glum, depressed, apathetic tone. And it's very like a criminal on the run. I agree there's nothing of that sort about Stravonok's cheerful patter. But how can we start by basing ourselves not on the objective data of our science, but on something foreign to it? I've got a fair amount of experience in working with voice prints now, and you must believe me, there are all sorts of elusive signs that make me absolutely certain it's Stravonok. I've simply no time to measure everything with a divider on the tapes and translate this into figures. This was just what Reuben the humanist never had time for. But if you told me that at this moment I must pick one of the two names and vouch for it, I'd say Stravonok with almost no hesitation. Right, but we won't do that, said Reutemann. We'll go to work with the divider and put the result down in figures, and then we can talk. But think of the time, the urgency. But if it's the way to get at the truth. Just look for yourself. And seizing the paper tapes and scattering more ashes over them, Reuben furiously argued the case against Stravonok. That was how the Major General found them when he waddled in, slowly and masterfully on his short legs. They knew him well. The set of his sheepskin hat and the curl of his upper lip were enough to tell them the General was highly displeased. They jumped up, while he sat down in a corner of the sofa, thrust his hands into his pockets and grunted, "Well?" Reuben was silent as protocol required, leaving it to Reutemann to report. As he listened, Osklepov's heavy face assumed an expression of deep thought. His eyelids drooped sleepily, and he made no movement towards the pieces of tape offered as evidence. Reuben listened to Reutemann's report in anguish. Clear and intelligent as it was, it emitted everything of the inspiration, the almost supernatural certainty which had guided him in his work. Reutemann said in conclusion that both Stravonok and Volodin were suspect, but further records of their conversations were needed for a final verdict. Looking up at Reuben, he said, "But I think Lev Grigorievich wants to add or correct something." So far as Reuben was concerned, the General was wood from the neck up. He had not the slightest doubt about that. But at the moment, he was also the eye of the state, and willy-nilly, the representative of those progressive forces to which Reuben was dedicated. So he spoke excitedly, brandishing the tapes and the album. He begged the General to understand that although it was true that their conclusion was still ambiguous, there was no such ambiguity about the science of voice printing itself. They just didn't have the time to arrive at a definite verdict. But as for his own, Reuben's personal opinion, no longer sleepy, Osklepov looked at him with distaste. "You think I care a damn about your science? It's the criminal I want. Now mind what you say. Have you got him among that mess on your table or not? Is he still at large? There's nobody apart from those 5. He glowered at them while they stood in front of him with nothing to hold on to. Reuben dropped his arms, letting the tape he was clutching trail to the floor. Like a black dragon at their backs, Molozadov crouched over the tape recorder. Reuben was confused. He had not expected to speak about this aspect of the matter at all. More used to the ways of authority, Reutemann mustered all his confidence. Yes, actually, well, we're sure he's one of them." What else could he say? Osklepov narrowed his eyes. "Are you prepared to stand by that?" Yes, we vouch for it." "Well, I didn't put words into your mouth. I'll go straight off and report to the minister. We'll arrest both of the swine." And from the way he looked at them, he might have meant Reutemann and Reuben. Wait 24 hours, said Reuben. Give us a chance to produce the complete evidence. You'll have your chance when the investigation begins. We'll put a microphone on the interrogator's table and you can listen in for hours on end if you like. But one of them is innocent, said Reuben. Innocent? What do you mean? Osklepov's green eyes opened in astonishment. Not guilty of anything at all. The security service will sort that out. Having said this, he left without a word of praise for the two exponents of the new science. Such was Osklepov's style of leadership. Never praise a subordinate, then he'll try harder. Nor was it only the personal style of the general. It came from above. The tone was set by himself. Although they were used to it, they felt dejected. They sat down in the same chairs in which they sat such a short while ago, dreaming of the great future of their science. They said nothing. It was as if their whole beautiful, fragile structure had been stamped on. Since two could be arrested to make sure of one, why not arrest all five and make it even easier? Reutemann felt how precarious was the existence of the new unit. He remembered that the acoustics half of it had been broken up, and the same sense of loneliness and of the harshness of the world which he'd felt last night came back to him again. Relaxing after his intensive spell of work, Reuben, on the other hand, felt relief. The simplicity of Osklepov's decision showed that people would have been arrested anyway, without Reuben and without his voice prints. Maybe he'd saved 3 of them. The burning inspiration which consumed him for so many hours was extinguished. He remembered his liver, his head ached, and he remembered his hair was falling out, that his wife was growing old, and also he still had more than 5 years in prison ahead of him. In the past few years, everything seemed to be going wrong, and now Yugoslavia was in disgrace. Neither of the two men said anything of this. They just sat in silence. And Smolazadov was there, silent at their backs. Rubin had already pinned a map of China to the wall, with the communist-held territories penciled over in red. It was the only thing that heartened him now. In spite of everything, we are winning. There was a knock at the door, and Reutmann was called out. He had to make sure that the free workers from acoustics would attend a lecture by a visiting speaker. Today was Monday, the only evening in the week devoted to political studies.